This video is going to be talking about how to set up the argumentative outline. So let's first start with the setup of the beginning. So the intro is pretty much not going to change. What we had from the informative and persuasive speech is still there. As far as the attention getter, the thesis and preview, the value step is connecting the audience, and the ethos is your credibility. And in a second, I'm actually going to show you an example outline just so you can see what that looks like. Now, the body of the speech, this is actually where things do change. You do need to actually have arguments, and of course I am talking about legitimately developed full arguments based on what we've been talking about, which is Tolman's model of argument. So keep in mind when I reference one argument encompasses claim, data, and warrant. So, how many arguments do you actually have to have? While many arguments may rely on just one thing that they talk about, you do actually for this speech have to have 4. And keep in mind, one other thing you need to have is a counter argument. So just like Tolman's model, as far as, an argument being claimed out of warrant, there are 3 steps. 1 is a counterclaim. 2 is a reasoning for the counterclaim, and 3 is a rebuttal. This is what I covered in an earlier homework, so just go back if you have any questions. And in case you're wondering, you cannot put a counterclaim in a counterclaim, but professors do love counterclaims. Research. So this is where your data comes in. Keep in mind you are going to have sources for this. 7 will be required. So this is where you're going to need studies, statistics, things like that to really back up what you're saying. The other thing is 2 of your sources must be from the database, and by that I mean the school's database and or books. You can use Google Books, things like that. Remember, to get into the database, you can of course actually visit our library, or you can just go through PantherWeb to access all of the sources. Now, as far as sources, you do have to remember that you still need to think about the credibility of your material, and in order to do that, as it says here, one does simply not use information without applying the CRAAP test. So, you have to go through this because I will be specifically grading you on this. As far as what you need to consider, purpose and authority will be especially important. I noticed a lot of people lost points on the persuasive speech because they were picking sources that did not have a journalistic, informative, or educative purpose, and authority, they weren't that credible. So remember, purpose is the goal of the writer or institution. You want to make sure that you have a source that isn't biased or isn't trying to push some sort of agenda. Just to give you an example, if you're doing a speech on, say, legalization of marijuana, this particular organization constantly fights for legislation that would pass the legalization of marijuana. So obviously they have a particular agenda. That doesn't mean that everything that they say is wrong, but they are probably going to point you in a particular direction to help their case. So you want to rely more on sources that have a purpose, like I said before, that is journalistic or informative, and authority, again, credible sources. So I am going to actually show you an example of an outline. The topic is going to be on the legalization of prostitution because, hey, let's just keep things interesting. So this is the example I just referenced. The attention getter is right here. It is, a story about a single mother who actually is a sex worker, and now she's actually been put in jail. So this actually is also utilizing pathos. Now, the student who actually did this then kind of segues. So Rachel is one of the many examples why the U.S. government should legalize prostitution. Keep in mind, all the thesis has to be is specifically addressing your position and the change, so that she is for legalizing prostitution. Ethos, so your credibility. I've worked at a bail bonds office since I was 17 years old, and many individuals I've encountered were arrested for sex work. I'll just say this individual is a female, so she did not encounter the sex workers in the way you may be thinking. Moving on. Value step. So you may not have been in contact with sex workers, but your tax money is going there, right? So this is directly connecting them. The preview is going to be a preview of the argument you're going to touch on. So it's a waste of money, it keeps sex workers in danger, and it hurts workers' earnings. Those are some of the things that will be touched on. So that is the introduction. Like I said, the body itself is going to be based on your particular argument. So notice now she is transitioning into the body. So let's start looking at that. Each of your points are going to be your claim. So this is claim 1, claim 2, and she has additional claims that I'll talk about in a second. The first one she has is the criminalization of prostitution is a waste of taxpayer money. So this is a legitimate argument for her position. She then cites a source talking about the specific cost, that it costs about $2,000 on average to incarcerate, to arrest, all that sort of stuff. You'll now notice here she's actually engaging the audience. So she has an additional statistic on how much it costs a city to have a war on prostitution. So she's asking them to guess that particular piece of information. Keep in mind you do have to engage the audience in 2 places in the speech. Now she put it here, you don't have to have it here, it's honestly wherever you want. It could be in the introduction and in another point, it could be in the conclusion, it's completely up to you. Then the warrant, remember, is connecting that information. So she's saying it makes this much annually, it's lucrative, so why not waste money, let's tax it like Nevada. Now she is transitioning, so keep in mind between each of your claims, your arguments, you would want to have a transition. This one's a little bit long, it only needs to be a sentence, but anything that's going to connect the 2 points is what we need. So the next thing she talks about is making sex workers safer. She then uses Nevada as an example, and she quotes a Business Insider article, and then talks about the fact that because it's state regulated, like she mentioned in the claim and data, that it would actually be safer. She then transitions into the next point, and this actually is just a sentence, which again, like I said, is all you really need. The next one is sex workers are vulnerable to abuse because of the criminalization of their profession. Here she is actually using a journal article that she found from the database, and she states that sex workers are typically at a 45 to 75% chance of experiencing violence at some point. She then quotes another article. So one thing to keep in mind, if you need 7 sources but you only have 4 arguments, you're clearly going to need to have more than one source and at least one argument in order to reach that. So there will be a point for certain points that you will need to add more than one piece of data. It's completely up to you where you think that's necessary, but just keep that in mind. So she talks about Germany and New Zealand, that they've legalized it, the violence there has decreased. She's then saying it's in society's best interest to protect them, and countries that have legalized it have seen it, so this points to the possibility of decreasing rates in the U.S. Keep in mind, she says possibility. This actually would count as a qualifier because of the fact that she's recognizing the limits. It most likely will happen, but there's obviously no guarantee. Like I mentioned earlier, a counter argument is also required. So her counterclaim, now my opponent may say prostitution is immoral and disgusting. The reasoning, because it is a threat to the moral fabric of society and it is wrong to pay for sex. And then the rebuttal, well, however, you should look at other areas of sex work that is legal, pornography, and, if individuals are paid but it's taped, and then she sort of asks this question right here, that why is one legal and the other one is not? That really doesn't make any sense. You might also be wondering why it's italicized and highlighted. That is because in this speech you also actually have to use a rhetorical device. Here she is using a rhetorical question, which is why she has highlighted it, so I know. Also keep in mind I'm labeling all these things, the reason, the rebuttal. You don't have to label them in the way in which I'm doing it. I'm just really trying to make it clear for you what all these steps are. And then backing, so she is adding something additional after the rebuttal. So here is an actual source utilizing the Constitution. She then moves on to her 4th claim. Now keep in mind she put her counter argument before she finished all of her arguments. There is no specific place that the counter argument has to be. It just needs to be in the outline. So you do not have to put it as your 3rd point. It could be your 5th point. It could be your 1st point. It's really up to you. And then sex workers in many cases is a victimless crime with consensual adults. She talks about the criminal code focusing on murder and theft. Then she also quotes a Cornell University law professor. So this is the quote she uses. And then basically saying that this is, sort of contradictory. The conclusion, so she goes back to her story here about the individual who's jailed multiple times, and then she also highlights this again because she is using a rhetorical question again as her rhetorical device, and then she has her work cited here. So that is what the outline needs to look like, so you will continue that process. So homework. First, what does not change from the last 2 speeches? What two parts of the CRAAP test are most important that I specifically referenced that people had problems with for the persuasive speech? What was the value step of the example speech? What was the counterclaim in the example speech? And then last, and especially most important, create 3 arguments for your formal speech topic. Remember, your formal speech topic is the one that you picked during the speed dating activity. These are the ones on, the electoral college, the backdoor for encrypted phones, those topics that you did. So you now want to take the sources that you had to submit for the last homework and put them in for this particular homework.